centuries before the empire, long before the Republic. It was a monarchy. This is the story of Rome, and how it almost never came to be. All across Europe and the Mediterranean, from Spain to Greece to North Africa, you'll find the ruins of once majestic buildings. Evidence of a civilization that thrived for over 1,000 years and still found a way to continue even after its fall. This was Rome, an expansionist power that has been recognized and studied more than any other in history. But before it was a continent-spanning militaristic empire, it was far less, and nobody knew what it was destined to become. According to the famous foundation myth of Rome, the story starts here, on the Italian Peninsula. The city of Alba Longa, part of the small community of Latin cities resting south of the Tiber River, was ruled by King Numitor. The Latins claimed descent from the legendary Aeneas, a hero from the Trojan War, who left the devastated city and traveled west, settling in Italy. King Numitor had an envious brother, Amulius. Younger than Numitor, he would never see the throne, as Numitor had many sons who were next in line. So Amulius did the only thing he could do. He had the king's sons murdered, and ran Numitor himself out of the city. Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, was also made to become a priestess of the goddess Vesta, which would become known as a Vestal Virgin. She was to remain chaste under penalty of death, effectively killing off any chance for Numitor to have another successor. Amulius was unaware though, that Rhea Silvia was already pregnant, with twins, from the god Mars. Once they were born, Amulius ordered both to be drowned in the Tiber River. His servant brought them to the river, but it was in flood, so the babies, named Remus and Romulus, were left on the riverbank to die of exposure. It all could have ended here, if not for a she-wolf, named Lupa. She found the twins, and nursed them back to health. Soon after, a shepherd found the infants, and took them in, raising them. Once the boys became adults, they got their revenge on Amulius, deposing him and restoring Numitor to the throne. The twins then set out to found a city for themselves, near the Tiber River where they were found as infants. But Numitor and Amulius' familial patterns manifested in Remus and Romulus, and they began to bicker over who should be king of this new city. To solve this problem, they asked the gods for a sign. Remus went to wait on the Palatine Hill, the hill he preferred to build the city, while Romulus waited on the Palatine Hill. Remus was the first to see a sign, 6 birds which flew by. Ancient Roman religion interpreted omens from the behavior of birds. Later on, Romulus saw 12 birds. Both believed they won, as Remus saw his sign first, but Romulus saw double the amount. Deciding to settle the dispute in a more conventional method, they came to physical blows, and during the fight, Remus was killed by his brother. Romulus then founded the city of Rome around the Palatine Hill, naming it after himself. The legendary date for this was April 21, 753 BCE. Apart from this myth, the true story of Rome's founding is perhaps lost to history. The oldest Roman sources we currently have are from around the turn of the millennium, and they were clearly influenced by stories from other cultures. From the Greeks, the myth of a virgin birth, like that of Dionysus, and similarities to the story of the twins Castor and Pollux. From further east, they took aspects of the story of the birth of Sargon of Akkad, which in turn influenced the story of the birth of Moses. Archaeological discoveries tell us other parts of the myth could possibly be based in reality. Settlements seem to have begun in the 900s BCE, and we believe Rome itself began as 2 settlements, one on the Aventine Hill and one on the Palatine Hill, occupied by different Latin tribes, perhaps joining sometime in the 600s BCE. It's possible the Palatine Hill tribe overcame the Aventine, which parallels the Romulus and Remus story. These weren't the only hills in the area. While the Palatine Hill was the nucleus, Rome eventually expanded to cover 7 nearby hills. The hills made the area easy to defend, and the Tiber River was a perfect natural barrier as well. Early Romans were mainly farmers, taking advantage of the fertile plains of the Tiber. And so, Rome had almost everything it needed to thrive. But how can one thrive in so small a space? While Rome was growing, Italy was already filled with other cultures and civilizations. Directly around them were the other Latin tribes, all descended from the Italic language family, part of the Indo-Europeans. In the south of Italy was what the Romans would call Magna Graecia. These were colonies from Greece, which we have mentioned in previous episodes of this chapter. Across the Tiber, to the north, were the Etruscans, a loose alliance of cities that controlled all of northern Italy until the Po Valley. The Etruscans were not Indo-European, predating their arrival, but they would eventually be influenced by the Greeks. They adopted the Greek alphabet, adopted Greek gods, and traded extensively with the Greeks. Rome's beginnings weren't much different from the other Latin tribes in the region. They were just a small kingdom, and would stay this way until the late 500s. Roman history claims that 7 kings ruled over Rome, starting with Romulus in 753 BCE. Son of Mars, god of war, Rome under Romulus was filled with conflict. The most notorious incident involved the Sabines, a nearby Italic tribe. According to Livy, the Roman historian, Romulus had opened up his new settlement to fugitives and travelers, in order to grow the city, which stagnated at a population of around 3,000, but this caused a very disproportionate male population. To remedy this, he held a festival and invited the Sabines to join. At his signal, his men abducted all the young Sabine women and took them for themselves. Anywhere from 30 to almost 700 women were kidnapped. Furious, the Sabine army, composed of the women's fathers and husbands, marched on Rome repeatedly, but the women urged them they were treated well, and there was no need for bloodshed. The men were convinced, and there was peace. Both the Romans and Sabines created a joint kingdom. Though Rome began as a kingdom, the king wasn't an autocratic ruler. Romulus had established the Senate, a body of 100 noblemen which served as an advisory council, and kept the king in check. Other citizens would be represented in the Curiate Assembly. After Romulus died, around 716 BCE, it was the Senate who chose the next king, who took power in 715, Numa Pompilius. Numa was a Sabine, but most likely also legendary. Under his rule, Rome became less militaristic, and grew into a more civilized society. He constructed the Temple of Janus, and after establishing peace with Rome's neighbors, closed the doors of the temple, signifying a new beginning for Rome, free of conflict. He established the Vestal Virgins in Rome, along with the cults of Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus, the latter of which was thought to be a deified Romulus. The Roman calendar was also reformed, and he established the position of chief priest of Rome, called Pontifex Maximus. In 672 BCE, Numa died, with Rome still at peace. The next king, however, Tullus Hostilius, brought back Rome's killer instinct. He waged war with all surrounding cities, including the Etruscan cities to the north, and the remnants of the Sabine region. More importantly, Alba Longa, the Latin city from which Rome originated, was conquered and destroyed. Tullus died around 640 BCE, said to be struck by a lightning bolt from Jupiter. The next king, Ancus Marcius, was King Numa's grandson, and continued his peaceful methods. He used diplomacy to unite the smaller Latin cities around Rome and relocate them to the Aventine Hill. Ancus was also responsible for founding the important port of Ostia, and the building of Rome's first aqueduct. Rome's fifth king, taking power in 616 BCE, was Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, or Tarquin the Elder. He wasn't Latin or Sabine, but Etruscan. he migrated to the city at a young age, as a wealthy nobleman. Sources differ, but he either bribed his way to the top, or was chosen by the former King Ancus as an heir. This began a period of Etruscan influence over Rome. The Etruscans had been older, more established, and more developed than Rome, and now the Romans became more familiar with their culture, a culture which itself was influenced by Greece. After a 38-year rule, he was replaced by his son-in-law, Servius Tullius, who was king for over 40 years. Both of these Etruscan kings were quite beneficial to Rome, fending off attacks from other Etruscan kings to the north, and subduing some Latin cities to the south. The accumulated wealth was used for magnificent building projects. Under Tarquin, Rome constructed the Circus Maximus, a stadium for chariot racing and other mass entertainment. Also under his rule, the Cloaca Maxima was built, regarded as one of the earliest sewage systems in the world. This drained the site of what would become the Roman Forum, a plaza that became the most important in Rome. They also constructed the Pomerium, a great wall around their hills, and replaced simple house huts with houses made of stone. Servius also reformed the Curiate Assembly, by grouping citizens based on economic class, creating the Centuriate Assembly, which dealt with the military. He would also create the Tribal Assembly, which grouped citizens based on region, and dealt with civil issues. Servius ruled well for over 40 years, but would become victim to a conspiracy by those closest to him. His daughter, Tullia, was engaged in an affair with his nephew, a man named Lucius Tarquinius, or Tarquin the Younger. Both were married, but the scandal didn't end there. They murdered both their spouses, and married each other. Then, they conspired for the throne. Before long, Tarquin got what he wanted. Tarquin threw Servius down the Senate steps, into the arms of his men, and the king was assassinated. Tullia then rode her chariot over her father's body. The plan was a success. Tarquin was now king. Little did he know, he was not to pass down this royal lineage. Tarquin's reign was brutal and autocratic, giving him the name Tarquinia Superbus, meaning arrogant, or proud. He confiscated property, had petty troublemakers killed, and ignored the traditions of the Senate and Assembly. The main accomplishment of his reign was the completion of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the most important temple in ancient Rome. The tipping point occurred when the king's son sexually assaulted Lucretia, the daughter of a prominent Roman nobleman. In shame, she then took her own life, her lifeless body being seen by all in the public square. Her husband, Tarquinius Collatinus, pleaded with his fellow people to avenge this wrongdoing. Collatinus and friend Junius Brutus gathered citizens to revolt, and when King Superbus was out of the city, Collatinus and Brutus took control. When Superbus returned, the doors to the city were closed to him, and he ended up going into exile in 509 BCE. And so, with the last of the 7 Roman kings deposed, the Roman kingdom was dissolved and reformed. This account from Livy is most likely not fully accurate. It could be based on Greek accounts of city-states and their tyrants, but it could be an explanation of how the Romans shed themselves of foreign rule, as their last 3 kings were all Etruscan. The Senate then abolished the position of monarch, and Collatinus and Brutus were elected as leaders. They could veto each other's decisions, and their powers would only last a year. Once the year was over, they could be prosecuted if they had abused their powers while leading. Though they held the highest office in Rome, they would not be kings. They were instead consuls. The Romans all agreed to never let a king rule again. This marked the end of the Roman kingdom and the birth of the Roman Republic. Generally accepted as beginning in 509 BCE, this date has been questioned by modern historians, as it might have been adjusted to predate the founding of Athens and Athenian democracy in 508 or 507 BCE. Whichever came first shouldn't matter, as both Rome and Athens took different paths. From the north, the Etruscans attempted to reclaim their important cities. To deal with these attacks, Rome appointed their first dictator, a man who held the entire power of the state, and could act without an appeal to the Senate or Assembly. This might sound like Rome reverting to kingship, but this dictator was forced to relinquish all his power after a 6-month term. It was more of an emergency general. Roman citizens were encouraged to assassinate any dictator who dared hold on to the power. And for centuries, no dictator did. Rome fought back against the Etruscans, and was victorious. But Rome's northern neighbors only sought to expand southwards, because they were losing their own territories around the Po Valley, to another enemy. The Golli, later known as Gauls, were part of the Celts, who expanded around Europe during the Bronze and Iron Ages. The Gauls themselves emerged north of the Alps, and spread all throughout Western Europe, and eventually the East as well. At this time, in the late 500s, they would begin expanding into Etruscan land in northern Italy. Defeating them, the Gallic tribes then created settlements of their own, like Milan and Verona. With Rome to their south, and the Gauls to the north, the Etruscans ceased to be a factor, and became a misplaced nuisance between two more powerful foes, who themselves were perhaps destined to clash. While there was conflict brewing outside of Rome, Rome had its own internal problems. The conflict of the orders was a class struggle, lasting from around 500 to 287 BCE. Wealthy landowners and aristocrats were called patricians. They were the descendants of the senators from the Roman kingdom. The rest of the free citizens were just commoners, or plebeians. They greatly outnumbered the patricians, but had exponentially less land and wealth, and were effectively shut out of government. They were also just one wrong turn away from slavery. Plebeians who borrowed money from patricians during hard times, like a famine, or during war, had to hold themselves as collateral. If they couldn't repay the loan, they became slaves. This came to a head around 495 BCE, when an old soldier wandered into the Roman Forum, and told his story about how he had gone into debt and become a slave, a very disheartening tale for the plebeians to hear, from an old veteran. After all, he had fought for the glory of Rome. The plebs didn't have much power, but they did have numbers. So the smartest strategy was to go on strike. The plebs formed the majority of the Roman army, and Rome was currently engaged in a war with 3 surrounding Italic tribes. Refusing to fight, the plebs waited on the sacred mount outside the city. This was the first secession of the plebs. Inside Rome, the Senate panicked, and the consuls had to intervene, and offered the plebeians a voice in government, creating the office of plebeian tribune. This new office would put a check on patrician abuses. They had the power to veto any legislation, and the office was blocked to patricians. Declared as sacrosanct, not even the consuls could oppose them. Throughout the next few decades, the power struggle remained evenly fair between the consuls, senate, and tribune, so Rome decided to take a page from Solon in ancient Athens, and create a fair and popular law code. In 451 BCE, the Decemvirs, a group of 10 lawmakers, were appointed to write the new law code for Rome. Written on wood, and displayed in the Forum for all to see, they created the laws of the 12 Tables, the foundation of Roman law. While this was all brought about by the plebeian secession, there were still some laws unfavorable to them, such as Table 11, forbidding marriage to a lower class. With class tension somewhat eased within Rome, it could now deal with its external problems, and continue expanding into central Italy. The target, Veii. Veii rested just 16 kilometers, or 10 miles, from Rome, just over the Tiber River, and was the richest Etruscan city. With their Etruscan allies dealing with the Gallic tribes to the north, the Romans laid siege to Veii. This early Roman republic wasn't the military powerhouse it would soon become, and didn't have the necessary siege equipment for a quick strike. The siege was on and off for many years, but in 396 BCE, the Romans tunneled into the city and took the Etruscans unaware. The city fell, but the long battle left the Romans depleted. According to Livy, it was at this unfortunate time that another Etruscan city further north, Clusium, pleaded with the Romans for aid against the encroaching Gauls. Rome's army was tired, so they sent messengers to make peace through diplomatic means. Peace talks broke down into argument, and in 387 BCE, the Gauls set their sights on Rome itself, and under their leader, Brennus, thundered down to the Tiber. There, the beleaguered Roman army awaited them. So few were their number, that Brennus thought the Romans were preparing an ambush. Soon realizing it wasn't a trap at all, Brennus charged and the coalition of Gallic tribes obliterated the Roman army. Those who survived tried to flee across the Tiber, but drowned or were killed in the rout. Brennus then marched on Rome itself. With the Roman army defeated, all citizens ran and sought refuge at Palatine Hill. From the hill, they witnessed the Gauls sack and burn the city, while massacring any unfortunate soul left behind. The Gauls then occupied the city for 7 months, the only time Rome would be occupied by foreigners for 800 years to come. It could have all ended here, and we'd never have heard of this now famous city. But Rome was saved by an unlikely ally. Disease. The Gallic tribes failed to bury their dead. Before long, plague struck their camps. Now, they became more open to a Roman proposition, and were offered £1,000 of gold if they left the city. According to Livy, the Gallic scales were faulty, and when the Romans spoke up about it, Brennus threw on his own sword, further unbalancing the scales. Some Roman historians add that Marcus Furius Camillus, a famous general and dictator from the siege of Veii, returned from exile right at this moment, with an army he amassed from the surrounding regions. A fight broke out and Camillus defeated the Gauls, expelling them from the city. Though the Gauls had left, Rome lay devastated. They were no different than the other cities on the peninsula. Rome was nothing special, just another Latin settlement, desperately fighting to expand. But this was their new reality. Not only could they lose a battle, they could lose Rome itself. At their lowest point, all they had was a second chance. They would rebuild, bigger and better than ever. With a hardened resolve, it wasn't just Italy in Rome's sights anymore, but Europe itself. They knew not their destiny, but knew who they were. And that was enough. In truth, the sack of Rome never destroyed Rome. It created it. Nonetheless, this was seen as a rebirth for Rome, and Camillus was considered the second founder of this famous city. And so, with this epilogue, this chapter comes to an end. Through the rise and fall of ancient Greece, to the birth and rebirth of Rome, from the 300s BCE onwards, the shape of Europe is about to change. We'll get to the rest of Rome's story, but while Rome continue their Italian campaigns, we head back east. Not to Athens or Sparta, but to the north, to a player which had yet to shine. Next chapter, we delve into the Hellenistic era, and how this unimpressive kingdom of Macedonia took on the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. Next episode, we open up a new chapter, and follow the rise of one of the greatest generals of all time. This is Alexander's Age.